So MongoDB is a NoSQL database company. Speaking of unicorns, MongoDB will be doing more than, $1 billion in recognized revenue this year. It's a public company, started in 2007, has close to 40,000 customers using it. So a really exceptionally great business that has been doing extremely well in the past few years. However, back in 2016, when Sahir joined, it looked very different. So I want to kind of start there, and maybe Sahir, you can chat a little bit about, MongoDB was still private, hadn't gone public yet. How did you end up joining MongoDB, and what was the reason that you were brought in?
Sure. So first of all, thank you all for having me. This is a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. So when Alex said, would you fly out from New York to participate, I was like, yes, my people. The story of how I got to Mongo. So, clearly as somebody in infrastructure or enterprise technology, I was generally familiar with MongoDB. And I had spent the last kind of few roles in my career kind of making two transitions, from one personally from like go-to-market roles into product roles to kind of round out my experience in terms of like the factory side of a software business. And then also just transitioning and really trying to become as knowledgeable about SaaS business models as I could possibly be. So that was kind of a transition I'd purposely been going through over a few years in a few different companies in my personal career. But then, MongoDB, knowing I had built some conviction that for open source companies, SaaS was ultimately the right model. And in 2014, MongoDB had brought on a new CEO, David Echeria. I'd worked many layers under him many years ago with a company founded called BladeLogic. And so I certainly had kind of leadership connection once he joined. And I was like, all right, I know this is a great leader who knows how to execute and especially drive go-to-market. And it's ripe with opportunity because MongoDB is just an open source phenomenon with a lot of users. But ultimately the thing that compelled me was kind of the company's decision to really transition the business model from open source enterprise software subscriptions to consumption-based cloud model. And the opportunity to kind of lead that as a general manager and drive that transition both from a technology standpoint as well as a go-to-market standpoint was certainly something I saw opportunity in. It's been much more successful than I could have guessed at the time, and we've been very fortunate, but that's how I got there.
And at the time, Mongo was still in kind of the 100 million revenue range.
Yeah, we're roughly, I think we may be just shy of 100, somewhere right around there. We were about 2 years prior to going public. Employee count was probably somewhere around 550, 600, somewhere in that range.
And so when you joined to launch the Atlas product, right, which was the cloud product, what did the status quo in the company look like? How would you describe their current, because they had the big open source community and then they had a sales-led motion. Like, what did it look like? And what were the early goals of Atlas? Like, what was the expectation of, what happens when we suddenly introduce a more product-led concept in this $100 million company?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in 2016, just the way the business tended to work is open source is very much around driving developer adoption, getting this massive user base globally. And however, our monetization model was very much a traditional and outbound enterprise software, demand gen enterprise software model. So we have this like massive base of users and opportunity, but we're really only monetizing a subset of that opportunity, meaning our proprietary technology, our software subscriptions that people would pay for really only have product market fit for large enterprises and governments. So we're sort of, although there's Mongo everywhere in every size of company globally in every segment, really it's, risk averse enterprise, and government kind of customers that really are willing to pay for the proprietary technology around managing and securing and getting the support and all of that around that. So it kind of limits the monetization of the value we've provided to the world quite a bit. And also, if you look at it, from say an application perspective or the life cycle of an application built on MongoDB, in a model where you have open source and we give the vast majority of our IP away for free, people aren't going to pay for all applications. They're only going to pay for the highest value ones that they want to make sure they have all the support and technology to manage effectively. And we're only really able to monetize the last part of the application's lifecycle, meaning when it's really in production and it's mission critical and driving the business. All of that sort of development and QA and all those other environments are effectively not on our opportunity list. So the way that looked in go-to-market was we had a quite healthy enterprise software sales team. At that time, the economics, the productivity of the sales reps, all of that was pretty good. But they were largely just upselling contracts to customers who had already adopted the open source technology inside the organization and just finding those customers that had high risk, high criticality applications and upselling them. We had an inside sales team at the time. I would say it was questionable whether that channel was really working because they're trying to take heavyweight enterprise software, despite how we tried to reprice or repackage it, and find sort of the needle in the haystack of a smaller customer that has similar needs. And the reality is they just don't. And many of them were very happy with just using our open source technology. So that was kind of questionable as to whether that strategy was really working. And then we had no idea, no self-service monetization at all. Certainly open source downloads drove the funnel in a way. So in that way we were product led, but we had no monetization. So that's kind of how the business looked at that time.
Got it. So with the goal of Atlas was to kind of bridge that gap. How did you think about what success for Atlas looked like, maybe a year after launch versus today, where it's like the majority of new revenue coming in? Congrats, by the way.
Thank you. So it was interesting because I think very early on, we definitely recognized that Atlas in the cloud business was not just another product or another SKU on the list for the sales organization. Like we saw it as a way to transform and diversify our go-to-market strategy quite broadly. But it also meant we needed to prioritize, because the other side of this is we've got a highly profitable subscription software business. We're 2 years-ish out from IPO. We don't know how that customer base is going to transition to a lower margin cloud product, or zero margin probably at that point, cloud product. And so basically, our first decision was, let's really start to get the self-service motion and that muscle kind of built in the company. Let's start building up that direct-to-developer monetization engine for the first time. And since inside sales was largely, in our eyes, not really producing the results we wanted, and we knew that cloud adoption, this is 6 years ago, in the mid-market tech companies and SMB was much higher than in the enterprise, we felt like we could use that as our sales test lab and really kind of pivot that team to ultimately being a cloud-only sales team. So we did enable the enterprise sales team. We did some work there, but really the first year to two, the focus was largely on the bottoms-up motion and trying to figure out how to drive self-service and how to upsell those customers via inside sales, and also have an outbound motion in inside sales, converting what were open source users of our technology into cloud customers. So that was largely the first kind of couple years. And it's interesting when we say like we focused on self-service, the honest truth was we had a website that had a lot of traffic because we have a big open source, sort of ecosystem. And we took a product you could buy on a credit card, and we kind of like glued those things together and, said, sign up here. But to say that we had any idea what we were doing at that time was completely not true. And, I think in many ways, what we saw was like, oh, there's revenue coming in here. And it was largely our leadership team, our board, that was like, you've got a bunch of enterprise software executives around the table. You got to go figure out this B2C PLG thing, because it really could be gold. And that led to a lot of organizational change. We hired a bunch of new people, talked a lot to Atlassian, brought a board member on who was at Atlassian, and just tried to really learn that business model. But we had to figure it out. That's not the DNA of the company. The DNA, I started my career in enterprise sales. Dave, our CEO, is an enterprise sales-oriented CEO. So we really needed to learn new skills as we built that bottoms-up motion in those early years. But I remember signing up for a $20 million ARR goal in like the first year and a half or whatever, and that seeming like totally crazy. And I remember I had hired our first head of growth, and he and I were sitting around the table building up the business model and all that, and we're like, if we can get to like 10, we're like totally made. This is going to be amazing. And so it's a long time since then.
So maybe dig into kind of org structure and how it started and how it evolved, since Cameron rightly brought up that where does growth sit is kind of a never answered question. So when Atlas first started, like, was it a very independent org, and what did Atlas own versus were more kind of shared goals across your, the company's CRO and CMO? Like, how did you figure out where to start? What did the Skunkworks team look like?
Sure. So we had a cloud engineering team, and they had decided they wanted a separate product management team for the cloud service that had SaaS backgrounds and all that, and that's ultimately why they called me. And however, the rest of the functions, we made a very purposeful decision early on, this is right, 2016, to not treat this as a completely independent BU. And in hindsight, that was a really important decision, because instead of creating a side project that had a separate team that's different from the core business, it gave us a mechanism to transform every single function into a consumption-based SaaS business. And so I had sort of budgetary control over the funding of cross-functional headcount, but I worked with each functional leader in the organization to say, what do you need to hire in SaaS skill sets? And they ultimately were responsible for hiring and building the motion with sort of a dotted line structure to me. And that matrix structure certainly was complex for me, especially, and my team to kind of manage through across functions. But I think it was really important because it did mean that everyone was part of the transformation and transition over time and felt accountable to it and felt bought into it versus, we've got this side project, it's never gonna get the funding because it's different than what's already working on the software side of business. So that was at the macro level. And then about 18 months in or so after we just really needed to double down on the bottoms up product-led motion, we did create a unified sort of growth team for the first time, which was a combination of analytics, product marketing, performance marketing, our first growth product managers, a few growth engineers in the beginning, and we just had sort of a SWAT team type in approach that reported into me. But the most important thing was really measuring that team the same way across all those functions and treating it with the same inspection and rigor as we treat our sales forecasts and our sales teams, and it's really became sort of like a channel. Now, over the years, as we've scaled, parts of it have sat in under different leaders. Now, the engine's definitely much larger, so we have a split function where growth marketing sits under the CMO, the product growth function sits under my teams. But at the same time, they operationally, we were just talking about this earlier, are exactly the same, they think as one team. It's regardless of where it is on the org chart. And I definitely spend a lot of time just trying to instill the culture that, frankly, the org chart's gonna shift based on the organization's scale and needs at any given time. It's really more important around how you goal people and how you create a culture where they don't see their team members as only who's on the org chart next to them, but is operationally part of a team that drives an outcome.
And do unified goal setting
yes,
so that...
for sure.
How much pressure was there early on in terms of revenue versus user volume, let's say, and how have you thought about that every year since?
Yeah, actually, I would say early on it was more revenue pressure in the sense that, it was definitely a goal of the company to show some significant revenue traction with the cloud product prior to IPO. So we were very heavily looking at how to drive revenue. I think over time, similar to what Cameron was talking about, we realized really the North Star for the self-service go-to-market especially is the volume of customers, we're bringing in. Certainly there's a quality bar there and all of that. But, I challenge the team, how do we get to 100,000 customers from 40,000 or wherever we are today? And that is very different than obviously what the sales team's thinking about, which is much more around overall revenue. And now that's changing these days too. But it was really interesting to hear Atlassian's approach, because I think this idea of acquiring customers, our version of that is acquiring workloads.
Right.
Because in a large account, there could be 1,000 applications. In some ways, every one of those is an independent sales cycle.
Right.
Now, down market, a new logo or a new customer is the same thing as a new workload, it's just smaller. But in a large account, that obsession around just driving more market acquisition is definitely how we've really oriented top to bottom the entire go-to-market engine.
Got it. So new workload is like your equivalent of a new team
Yes,
for
very much so.
Atlassian.
Yep.
Makes sense. And so what do some of the metrics look like for the growth teams in particular? Like how much do they lean into individual users versus workloads versus revenue? Like what does the stack ordered kind of priority metrics look like?
Yep. The top level business metrics we look at are definitely like the number of free tier users, paid tier users that we're converting, and then the overall what we call holistic ARR, which is kind of an attribution measure we have of revenue that's sourced through self-service, even though some of it may have transitioned over to sales. Actually, our best customers transition over to the sales team for coverage. So those are kind of the output metrics that we measure the business on. However, the growth team itself, their operating rhythm is much more focused on the customer success inputs to getting there. So they'll look at sort of how many users or workloads are getting to activation, how many are moving to a habitual usage, how many are retaining, and they're driving activities to move people through that funnel. And their activities are largely measured on that, and versus the number of paid tier users we have, which frankly takes time because it takes 3, 6, 9 months for an engaged free tier user to potentially convert to a paid customer in terms of a usage model based gate. And so it's like the operating rhythm is input based on driving customer activity and what we think is good usage. The output measures are what we look at the top level of the business to just make sure it's healthy, which are much more, the volume of customers and the aggregate ARR they produce.
Makes sense. And maybe you are unique in the sense that you also have an open source community of folks who know and quote unquote use MongoDB but don't have even a SaaS relationship. So almost feels like you could have had 3 different go-to-market teams, one focused on the open source community, one self-serve, one enterprise. What does that look like, and how do you leverage the community investment into the rest of this business model?
I would say as a developer-first company, nurturing a developer community, whether they're using our free technology, whether it be the open source or our free cloud service, that's like a must do. And in the beginning, we would always say okay, we have all these downloads that we can kind of loosely track. How do we get as many of them to switch over to being free cloud users as possible? And don't get me wrong, we still optimize the journey to get as much discovery on the cloud service versus open source as possible. But I think over the years, as we've sort of matured, we realize that's not a zero-sum game. Both metrics are growing very aggressively, and in many ways, I've started to think of open source as sort of the outer ring of adoption and the very, very top of our funnel. So yes, that's out there. There are millions of developers worldwide that are going to download our open source technology, run it in a Docker container on their laptop, start building their first app. Our goal is how do we make sure all of them over time also have a cloud account, and when they start to actually build something that goes to scale, they're not managing it themselves. And there's always a trade-off, and there's experiments we run on how to connect the tissue between those two motions a bit. But in general, we view both as part of a freemium strategy to try to drive overall developer adoption. So I think that's kind of the bottoms-up side. Now, we definitely in our market, there was a question earlier around how with the data technology, where you have complex negotiations around security and indemnity and all these other things, how does that work? I mean, we feel that every day. There are accounts that are just never going to buy in a self-service model, at least not in my career lifetime. You might have a tech company coming in through self-service out of whatever Turkey that spends $500,000 on a credit card, but then you need a $200,000 sales rep to get the first $20K land deal at Unicredit Bank in Italy. They're just not going to, they're not going to buy in that behavior. So we have what you would consider more traditional sales and marketing approaches that are much more top-down or outbound to break into those accounts. And I think philosophically, we never look at it as one is good and one is bad. We look at this whole system of, bottoms-up adoption or strategic enterprise selling and everything in between as sort of a journey, and we have to figure out which customers belong where on that journey and where they start in one part of one channel, maybe switch to another. And we kind of have this loose term called like Omni-channel go-to-market internally, and we really do think about all of it. Like, and as a CPO, even though I spend a lot of time building up the product-led motion, I care as much about getting some insurance company to be our first $100 million customer as I care, which is very much a deep account coverage model, account-based marketing kind of a model, as I do about getting from 40,000 to 100,000 customers. Like, we really do have both sort of sides of a go-to-market in one engine, and I think that's where a lot of the invention is for us. It's it's not saying we want to be one or the other. It's thinking about how we can build the best system to serve customers in a market that's $100 billion. Some who are going to buy on a golf course, and some who are going to buy on a credit card self-service, and matching all of those appropriately.
Got it. One of the things that I've noticed is often when people try to have kind of two channels, right?
Yep.
Whatever the channel is, you go from one to two channels, you immediately have this question of like, who owns the customer relationship and the channel outcome? What did those conversations sound like at MongoDB? Like, so if there's someone on a self-serve plan who has a question, like how does customer success and support get involved? Like, how do you decide who responds or owns the customer's problem and experience? And then if you're in a board meeting where we are discussing self-serve revenue, like which of the executives is supposed to like be, the person on the hook? Could you enlighten us a little?
Yeah, and I would say it's, this is not fixed. It definitely has evolved as we've scaled and the organization's changed. In terms of the discussions of which teams interact with customers along that journey, it's a constant evolution, and we just make sure across product, sales, CSM, support, marketing, that we are trying to drive a holistic view of the customer journey, and there's debates and discussions, and we try to make sure we have the right customer experience first, and then we match that to the profile and skill set that we have and where it sits in the org to make sure those handoffs are as clean as possible. And it's not perfect, it's always evolving and we're tuning things. But I think that's just, we have a lot of cross-functional discussions and workshops, and we run a lot of experiments. We've taken the approach of kind of experimentation and agile development kind of principles, frankly, to our go-to-market. Like, we are very quick to not wait to make one giant comp plan change once a year, but to actually carve out a team, carve out a small territory, a segment of customers, and actually try things at smaller scales, even when people are involved, to try to learn before we go make a larger scale change in the CSM or the sales team. So I think that culture kind of helps us try things out and get signal before we try to just change a comp plan for hundreds and hundreds of reps. So I think that's kind of one aspect of the internal pieces. In terms of like ultimate ownership of the revenue number, our CRO carries the sales targets, which is still the larger percentage of our revenue, because in our model, by design, we want our top customers to get some level of human assistance when appropriate, sooner rather than later. Because if we onboard a customer properly, and we have a very complicated product, it's a database, there's so many things a developer can do wrong when building against a database, we feel like it's much cheaper to solve that problem up front than it is down the line when they have a bad experience. So we rotate towards helping customers be successful, even if they need assistance, whether that's CSM, sales support, earlier rather than not. And since our unit economics are strong, we feel like that's a good kind of investment for us to make. But that tends to be our CRO. At the self-service kind of independent revenue, the metrics around new customer acquisition, historically it was all through product, and I would be the main executive. We thankfully have a fantastic CMO on board for the last year, and we've gotten more functional with growth marketing. And so he and a couple of his leaders, combined with a couple of my leaders, tend to be the ones that kind of present that number. I'd say it's kind of co-owned, but our CMO Peter is definitely taking more of the lead these days.
Got it. And there are a lot of go-to-market leaders here, and you also talked about how MongoDB kind of moved from like a very license and contract-based model to usage-based, which means that revenue is much more dependent on actual product adoption, like literally week over week. So what does the interface between product and sales look like? Like, how do you successfully partner together? What do you care about? Where do you challenge each other?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time with our CRO, who's I will quote, and I love this quote where he says, "I'm the chief revenue officer, not the chief bookings officer," which gives you insight into the mindset. And so, he cares a lot about how many self-service customers we're acquiring, because that's going to feed growth and scale of the sales team. Conversely, I spend a lot of time with him thinking about strategic selling and how we drive industry solutions to market. So there's a real partnership between product and both go-to-market leaders, CRO, CMO, and the three of us really work very, very closely together on all aspects of the motion. And, I think for me, a big part of what I believe is matching the product and the buyer behavior to the go-to-market. I think a lot of companies want to go be a PLG company, but their buyer behavior for their technology is never going to be bought that way, or it's going to take too long before you can kind of build a successful motion. So I think really being thoughtful around, is it going to be something that needs outbound enterprise selling, or is it something that can be frictionless, bottoms up? And when I say it's not even one product, but capabilities within a platform, all of those have their own journey. So we spend a lot of time kind of thinking through that between our CRO and I. And, it's also one of the things in our culture is we're always transforming. So even though we're north of $1 billion in revenue, it never feels like we're turning a crank and just doing more of the same. I mean, we're going through a pretty significant go-to-market transformation for probably the third time, next year, because we're really trying to optimize the business around consumption and driving more acquisition of volume. But yeah, between I think it starts with strong alignment and strong collaboration at the top of the organization.
And any kind of advice for this room in particular around how do you deal with the channel conflict of do I add more resources for the self-serve? Where do I compensate sales teams in terms of their role in the more product-led sales part? So what have been some of your top learnings there?
Yeah, I think you have to tune it. We made some good decisions in terms of only paying, for example, sales reps on growth of self-service accounts, not on just like flipping credit cards and taking commission checks to move into a commitment, because we don't value the commitment as much as you would think. And so there's a lot of thought that goes into those dynamics around handoffs, but we're also quick to realize when we got it wrong, and we have over-rotated. There are times where, we had our inside sales team just dipping into the credit card base, and we realized they're not really driving much incremental growth, but we're paying all this commission on some of these customers' organic growth, and so we tuned it back. So it's a lot of just math and measurement of the business, and I think if we're not a political organization in that way. We'd think first around what's driving a healthy P&L in business, and then work backwards from that on whether something needs a sales resource that's going to get the best return, or whether something's going to, needs product investment to automate some, upsell, cross-sell motion. But I think that's a team effort, and we're pretty transparent across all parts of the org of what's going well or not. We also try to create a feedback loop. So, it's very easy in growth product for it to be very quantitatively driven on the results of an experiment, and I love that too, and be very analytical. But the flip side is we have 100 CSMs or hundreds of reps that are talking to customers, 10 hours a day. They're going to have much more of a qualitative sense than we can ever experiment our way through in terms of what's working, what's not working well. So fostering sort of a really solid feedback loop to get that qualitative feedback, especially from the people who are engaging with customers most closely, and merging that qualitative data with the quantitative experimentation that we've built culturally, that's what we try to foster across those teams to try to determine ultimately, we can do something manually, but then we can bring back and automate. Meanwhile, there's things we want to automate, and we realize we can't automate that. We need a CSM or a seller to get engaged with the customer, and we're always experimenting with both sides of that.
Got it. Follow-up question and last question there, so we can then open it up to our awesome audience. Could you describe kind of what your week looks like in terms of how you run your exec team and kind of where do these cross-functional discussions happen so that you can have access to them and make sure that you're hearing the right things from the right people in like a very complex matrix organization?
Yeah, I would say it's a combination of things. I mean, on a weekly basis, we clearly have our executive staff meeting, and that gives us a way to sort of keep track of complex cross-functional, items and just be on top of sort of the big rocks in the business. But then that kind of happens at every layer. Like our growth team meets multiple times a week. When I say the growth team, that's a mix of marketing, product, the sales assist folks that pick up the self-service business all in one team, kind of measuring the metrics, looking at the funnel, trying new experiments and new motions. And I think we just have regular meeting cadences around that cross-functionally. We've also, and this is a little bit more as we've gotten to a larger scale of people and also, pandemic, just much more distributed, is we do try to pull together teams to do kind of on-site or off-site sort of in-person workshops where, we're mapping out a new version of our customer journey right now, for example. We got 20 people from every function, from sales ops through to engineering together and just kind of locked them in a room for 2 days to try to map that out and drive some consensus. And, sometimes it just takes that to kind of filter up all the different viewpoints because, a seller that's interacting with, customers in a high-touch model is going to have a very different perspective than a product manager that's just looking at metrics and experiments all day. And we want to get all of that on the table to come up with a collective understanding of how we want to drive the customer.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sahir. We'll open up the floor for questions. Yes, please.
Me. Okay.
Yep.
Hey, Sahir, Dave from Winning by Design. So when you establish the two go-to-market motions with self-service and sales poses, quote is a very strong motivator.
Mm-hmm.
And that threshold between those two, the quota would encourage what you mentioned of like the inside sales team dipping into the credit card base.
Yeah.
Can you just click into that and you said
Yeah.
you dialed that back, you pulled that back. How did you do that?
Yeah, so I would say at a macro level, we actually think of it as kind of 3 channels. Sort of self-service, which is an inbound. There's obviously pure self-service revenue, so to speak. Inside sales, which is a mix of upselling self-service customers as well as outbound selling on named accounts that just happen to be in the mid-market or startup segment. And then we would consider kind of true outbound strategic enterprise selling. So those are kind of the 3, I'm simplifying a bit, but that's kind of how we think about the segments and the teams overall. What we did is really, in the beginning, sales was really only measured on committed revenue, which frankly was a mistake. And so, but we did actually at the same time kind of protect a little bit of cannibalization by making sure that the sales team only got quota retirement on growth above the self-service run rate. So if a customer's spending $100K and they convert them for $120, they're only getting paid for that committed amount above the run rate. So that naturally protects against some bad behavior or cannibalization or the poor economics because they're only going to go where they see opportunity. Now, as we've shifted to more of a consumption-based comp model, it's not so much about the commitment, it's now just about the run rate growth of the MRR, ARR of their book. And so we make assumptions there around and we measure this obviously, like what a like-size book of similar customers in aggregate will grow organically, and then we only pay them basically on growth above that organic growth threshold. And we obviously measure all of that over time to make sure we feel like we're getting a return on the investment of the sales team that we're putting on those accounts. And ultimately, it's similar to what Cameron was talking about. We think a lot about potential as opposed to current exact spend. So for us, the number of developers, like is it a tech-driven company? Do we have other signals around how many downloads of MongoDB they have, and we use a combination of product behavioral characteristics combined with firmographic information to come up with basically a potential score, and that helps drive not where we have sales assistance earlier than maybe when they hit some sort of spend threshold alone. Now, where we're going is really trying to focus we'll keep having sales assistants on those high quality, high potential self-service customers. But then there's a whole segment of customers that are not just finding their way and are sort of searching for MongoDB and showing up on our website funnel. So we do have very kind of rigorous territory management and analysis to identify named accounts up and down the spectrum, enterprise all the way down to mid-market and SMB, of accounts we know or feel that are high potential that we don't want to just like hope they find it into our self-service motion. And that's much more of an outbound traditional pipeline generation model to kind of break into those accounts. But we'll pay those reps regardless of whether they come in on a credit card or they come in on a contract. It doesn't really matter to us. They can start either way, and they're just retiring sort of a consumption-based quota quarter over quarter. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Alex.
I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
One of the things that's always fascinated me about you and Mongo, and you and I started talking years ago, before Atlas was as successful as it is today, is how cross-functionally you approach the problem. You were a GM, you didn't think about it purely as what many would consider traditional product. I remember you fighting for, like, let's get this button on the website, on the homepage. And as I've seen your team grow, the thing about MongoDB that's really interesting is everybody seems to be a lot more cross-functionally oriented. And I guess I would say that most of the biggest challenges are cross-functional, not functional.
Yes.
And that's been very different, I would say, in a very positive light. And a lot of that seems to be sort of spearheaded to some degree by you. Could you talk a little bit about traditional functions and how you just philosophically kind of broken past that? Because I haven't really seen that sort of visualized in the same way in your organization like you did.
Thanks for calling that out. I spend a lot of time with my team sort of hammering home the point that I value much more their relationships cross-functionally across the company than I do within their sort of hierarchical team structure on the org chart. Because that kind of communication naturally happens. You're working on the same things, you report to the same managers, all that type of stuff. But the cross-functional aspects actually are where I think the highest value kind of gets generated in the business. I think for me personally, I thrive in variety. Like I get really bored if I'm just working on engineering backlogs or if I'm just working in, revenue-oriented marketing positioning stuff. So like I naturally just found myself being very cross-functional because I enjoy the variety of being, in all parts of the business and trying to be that glue that kind of connects them. But now it's way more intentional as something that we really just instill, hire for, promote for, drive processes around, especially for the product organization. I think at a more macro level, as the company has gone from 400 or 500 people to 4,000 to 5,000 people today, interestingly, it's the cross-functional projects well executed across all the organization that have the biggest impact. Because if we're going to add hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue growth in the next year, it's not going to be lots of projects doing a little bit. It's choosing the right projects and making sure we're really careful on where we're going to put all the wood behind the bat in terms of whether it's activating enterprise sales or driving marketing spend. And that's been a muscle, I think, at the company level we've had to learn, and we're still, I would say, not perfect at, is how do we, really execute long-running, cross-functional strategic initiatives at a scale of thousands of people, and how do we get good at it to be able to do it at 10,000 people and, $3 billion of revenue. And I think that is crucial and something a lot of where the executive team's energy is going right now is trying to organize that execution muscle. But, within product, within growth, it's just something that I don't hire a product person who only works inbound with engineering. I want a product person that can work just as fluently with marketing and sales and go on the road and really be that 360-degree sort of product leader.
Curious, what percentage of you guys' revenue is Atlas? And if you were starting a company today, would you have Atlas and software or just Atlas?
Great question. The percentage is roughly 65%. Atlas is going probably 3.5, 4 times faster than the software business. The software business is healthy, but the cloud business is a rocket ship. So I think over the years, the company just sort of has realized that. If I was starting today, I would not have a software business. I think it makes sense for us, given the momentum and scale we have today, and the company started, almost 15 years ago at this point. But if you look at many open source companies that are being founded today, open source is like the demand creation sort of engine, but the monetization is pure SaaS, and they're just skipping that whole, ship a proprietary software version. It is tempting. I talk to founders all the time that are like, oh, but this bank wants me to ship this, and I'm like, yeah, you'll be optimizing for some near-term revenue, but you're going to be paying a big tax of really running two business models. We're at a certain level of scale where we can make those things additive. Like, we view the enterprise software business as an on-ramp to future cloud business today, but it is two businesses in a sense. And if I were a smaller company starting off, I don't think it'd be really hard to balance those two constraints. And honestly, all of our new products over the last 3 years have been cloud only. We don't ship them as software at all.
Was that a hard decision? There must have been some debate.
I would say there wasn't a lot of debate. I think everyone internally understood the rationale of, we're going to be broadening the portfolio. If we want to drive product market fit quickly, we cannot afford to ship software and support 17 different versions of things and not have visibility into how customers are consuming it and using the product. I think there was just a lot of belief in that. I think conditioning our customer base to get comfortable with that was much harder than internally debating that. And a lot of our traditional customers would be like, I feel like you're leaving me behind. And I'm like, I understand. We're not shutting down the software business, but here's the rationale why. And I bet you're going to be at cloud meeting me there, on that journey within a few years. And I think that's, by and large, we had to kind of ride through that storm a little bit, but I think it was the right decision because we're able to just execute much, much faster.
Yes.
John from Arbeit. With the
John.
source community, you cannot be really salesy because you will update it. So how do you sell cloud to your source?
So it's a couple different, depends is the answer. So if it's very much a direct to developer starting a project, they're not really interacting with sales. They're coming into our self-service funnel and they're hitting mongodb.com, perhaps looking to download the open source and then saying, oh, they have this cloud service, I'll sign up for that instead. And then, they might be free users, and then eventually if they get to something real, it converts to a credit card and then goes down the cycle from there. However, there's also a latent and constantly evolving base of customers who choose to build applications on our open source version. And we do have an outbound sales motion where we try to identify those customers that have been building applications on our free version, and we sell them on a value proposition of, get out of the business of managing a distributed database, spend your resources on development, have that move over to us. We'll manage the database, you get all these other capabilities and features, and it's consumption-based model, all that type of stuff. And we've gotten really good at that business case and value proposition. So some of our larger deals are actually mature applications built on our open source technology, and we run a migrate play to move those into the SaaS version. And that's very sales-led. I mean, it happens in self-service too, but they're usually smaller applications because people are risk-averse to moving, a live application that drives their startup. Versus, if we're sales-led, we have technology, folks supporting them, helping them. And it takes a business conversation to prove that the value of doing that. Because they're thinking they're going from free to now they're paying us money. And it's like, no, you're paying for it. It's just showing up in people and infrastructure and other stuff. You're shifting dollars over to us, but ultimately your TCO is going down. So it's both sides of the funnel.
I'll do one more. Do you guys have a lot of differentiation between your cloud version and open source, or is it mainly the
The core database itself is consistent, and we want to put as much core IP into that for free as possible because we want people building those mature applications or choosing our technology because it's not sort of slimmed down or gated or limited in a way. However, on the cloud side, we've expanded the portfolio to be much broader, and there's many other services around the database and integrated in the database. Those we do not ship as software at all, free or paid. And so if you're starting with what we're known for, the core database, it's the same experience. We want to make sure there's always an on-ramp that doesn't require much change at all to get into the cloud. But once you expand into those new services in the cloud, you'd have to find alternatives to get off it. And that's not a lock-in strategy. That's more just a investment strategy of where we see growth in the future of the business.
Right. Last question before we wrap up for lunch. Given how quickly application development processes are kind of evolving right now, what keeps MongoDB up at night? What are you looking at to say, okay, 5 years out, what could disrupt us?
Yeah, I think clearly we spend time looking at the trends in the market in terms of what modern application development looks like, what modern data services look like, and that drives part of our roadmap, for sure. However, in terms of like what keeps me up at night, it's less the external factors and way more how we scale the organization, our leaders, our own execution. And I can say that because we're lucky to be in a giant market. Even at north of $1 billion in revenue, we're sub 2% market share in a market that's growing bigger than any of us or our competitors can capture. And so therefore that means that less of our time needs to go into like this zero-sum comparison of who's gonna win a particular account. And I've been at companies where that was the case, and it's just not here. But it puts a lot more stakes on, okay, how do we make sure the leaders we have that today are managing 100 people can scale to managing 2,000 people in the next few years? How do we make sure we maintain the culture of the company in a distributed world where we're hiring all these people? How do we, now in this economic environment, balance profitability with still trying to capture as much of that giant market as we can? It's those things, I think, that, we think about and stress us out, and is more within our own control than it is the externalities of some like new technology coming up. Not that there aren't great new technologies every day, but I think there's a much more outsized effect in terms of just our own execution.
Got it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Sahir. For one, I'm extremely glad you made the trip. And thank you for having Alex for convincing you to come over. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.